it on the beat.
Another edition of World History According to the Bible. My name is SHAMAR, and to my left,
Yatazar.
And tonight we're going to be going over the Renaissance, Supplanting Jacob. To start, let's get a quick scripture, Jeremiah 10 and 16.
It's the book of Jeremiah, chapter 10, verse 16. The portion of Jacob is not like them, for he is the former of all things.
Said Jacob is the former of all things. So the Renaissance means rebirth, right? It was a huge boom of culture, art, society, education within the districts of Europe, the jurisdiction of Europe, between about 1500 and 1700. So there's obviously quite a bit of information. I more so got big, moments, things that are pivotal to kind of build that foundation. But of course, we always encourage people to do their own research. And then when you get a chance, I switch us over to the PowerPoint. So we're the former of all things, right? Kind of. We're the former of all things because our people, contrary to popular belief, we're always taught in the world that our history started with slavery. Slavery here in America, way in, like the 1600s up until the 1800s. Then you had the Jim Crow, you had the, the segregation, you had all those kinds of things. But we have a rich history, right? Even in captivities, we've still been influential. We've still been heavy hitters. We've still been cultural icons. We've still been educated. Our people haven't diminished. All praise to the Most High, despite all the, the numerous captivities that we've gone through throughout our people's existence. So there is slavery to be mentioned on account of, that was a good portion of the history that we had. But a lot of what our people were doing was because of who they were around, who they were slaves to, all those kinds of things. When you get a chance, can you switch us over to the PowerPoint?
I think your HDMI is unplugged.
Oof. Is it getting feed?
No, it's not popping up.
Oh, look over to the left. Do you see it on the screens? It's on 2.
No, it's not there.
Oof. Yeah, it must have disconnected. 1 second, Israel. Is this? It's always this computer specifically, and always with me. Let's see. You got feed?
Okay, yeah.
Count all praises. Okay, so the Renaissance. Influence. Africans living in or visiting Europe during this time period included artists, aristocrats, saints, slaves, and diplomats. So we had one of the big things that was influential from our people during this time was, well, really was everything. We're going to cover just, just scratching the surface of all the information that's out there regarding our people. And then, of course, as well as some of the ways that a lot of this information has been hidden. But everywhere we go, Jacob being the former of all things, we're still going to be somebody. You know what I mean? Even here in America in captivity, the whole world is watching us. Ain't nobody really looking for what Esau is able to do. Esau running up the field, Esau getting in the ring. Everybody's looking for us, right? People are looking for the technological advancements. People are looking for the next generation of scholars, of doctors, of influencers, of, political figures. Then there's, so much money around Israel and in Israel, us as a people, just because of the numerous talents that our people have. And we had the same level of influence. And there's actually quite a bit of parallels between modern America and Europe. And not just in the fact that they're ruled by Esau or, white folks, but even in the way that the captivity was formed, even in the way that the captivity and how our people had to interact. All those things, there were a lot of similarities. Says, let's read this second point.
The presence of Africans and their descendants in Europe was partially a consequence of the drive for new markets beginning in the late 1400s.
So one of the main reasons why we were over there and in such heavy numbers was because people were constantly looking for new markets, new business. They were always wanting more and more of our people. So because of that, there were so many of our people being shipped over that eventually we started to become enough of a minority to be an influential class. Go ahead.
This included the importation of West Africans as slaves,
Right.
supplanting the trade of slaves of Slavic origin. Mm-hmm. There was also increasing conflict with North African Muslims and heightened levels of diplomatic and trade initiatives by African monarchs.
So a lot of it was coming West Africans, right? Which we know our people have been in the western coast of Africa. Even to this day, our people are still recognizing themselves and waking up to who we are in the western coast of Africa. Go ahead.
Free descendants of slaves were found at all levels of European society.
So there were a lot of, and it's the same way that we're here, right? We're the descendants of slaves, but now we're making something of ourselves. We're waking up to who we are. We're educating ourselves. We're starting businesses. We're becoming, like I said, that force. All praise to the Most High. That the same thing was happening back then. So say they had a grandparent or a parent that was born into slavery, and not all of them were even for life. Some of them would be for time periods. They could pay fees to be allowed out of the country. Some of them were able to buy their freedom. But because of the children that were born in that region, you had a lot of our people who had risen to political power, social power, economic power, because they were the descendants of slaves.
Africans were socially mobile and very quickly appeared in professional and creative positions in Europe.
So that's one thing, right? So because, think about this. If you were a slave to a carpenter, you're going to learn carpentry, right? If you're a slave to a stonemason, you're going to learn stonemasonry. If you're a slave to a monarch, what are you learning? You're learning political tactics. You're learning about finances. You're learning about rulership. You're learning all these different things. So as our people were slaves, though we were building up another kingdom and being subject to this other kingdom, there was a lot that our people took from those things that ended up being beneficial to us. Go ahead.
The late 15th and 16th centuries saw the first black lawyers, the first black churchmen, the first black school teachers, and the first black authors, and the first black artists.
So there were all those things because our people were under these people as slaves, learning these trades, learning these things, and then when they were free and they were no longer subject, they quickly rose into these positions, right? Because we have the skill, we got the soul, we got the salt. As soon as we're no longer subject to where someone's taking credit for that invention, taking credit for that work, or just coming along at the end to put a stamp on it, our people were rising into positions of power. But there was quite a bit of slavery. Let's read from the top.
There were two main routes by which enslaved Africans were brought to Europe, from the eastern Mediterranean of North Africa and from the west coast of Africa. But with the exception of Spain, in the mid-15th century, before the commencement of the slave trade from West Africa.
Uh-huh.
A black slave in Castle has leg irons around both ankles and a heavy chain linking one of them in his waist. In the inscription accompanying this last image, it is explained that the chain signifies that the wearer has already attempted an escape. 7, including an inscription or explanatory panel, was another route by which artists could ensure the viewer understood the African depicted was a slave.
So it said, and the image is going to be coming up next. It wasn't necessarily always a mark of a slave to have on chains and things like that, right? They would particularly put slaves who had attempted an escape in chains. So not every slave that was in Spain, that was in England, that was in the UK, right, in Europe, not all of them were ball and chain slaves. Oftentimes they had regular jobs. They were political figures. They were, like I said, churchmen, aristocrat, artists, and they weren't in ball and chain that entire time. They were just subject to the nation. However, if a slave had tried to escape, then they were given a ball and chain, especially a loud chain, to alert if he tried to run off. And you can read that last point.
Only very occasionally would large groups of Africans have been able to congregate in European city.
And that was one of the ways that they remained in power, was to keep our people from congregating. So you couldn't congregate for too many people couldn't congregate at one time. It couldn't be for over a certain amount of time. It couldn't be so often. There was a lot of different stipulations to keep our people from attempting revolts. So this is a slave that was spoken of before, with the chain around his waist, and he has the iron on his ankles, and it's captioned "Black Slave with a Wineskin." So this is a piece of artistry, and the reason, and as it was previously stated, it was depicted specifically so that you could identify the slave, right? So that would be apparent. Go ahead.
The conditions of enslavement often depended upon the status of the owner. If a slave was owned by an artisan, she or he lived in part of the artisan house and are food given by the artisan. But if a slave was owned by a king or queen or nobles, she or he was dressed well, fed well, and housed well.
So it was really based on what type of person they were under, right? That depicted their treatment. So if you were living under someone who was poor, low skilled, all that kind of stuff, chances are that slave would be poor, low skilled, etc. However, if they were in high positions of political power, you had an artisan, you would learn, what an artisan was doing. If it was an artist, if it was a minister, if it was a pope, a king, a monarch, you were learning about those things. They were fed accordingly, dressed accordingly, and educated according to whatever it was that their master was capable of. Go ahead.
Accounts from the Italian courts include many interesting payments for slave clothes, slave bedding, slave shoes, and slave artifacts. Mm-hmm. There is also the famous case of the Muslim travel writer Al-Hassan ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Wazan, known as Leo Africanus in Europe, who was captured, enslaved, and converted to Christianity under Pope Leo X in the second decade of the 16th century.
And that's one thing, right? You had a lot of our people that were converting to other gods, which we know is a curse in the Bible, right? Let's get Deuteronomy chapter 28 real quick. We know that this is a curse. So many of our people were subject, I believe it's 28? Yeah. So many of our people were subject to having to convert, and it's 36, Deuteronomy 28 and 36. Forced to convert to Catholicism, forced to convert to Christianity. Some were forced to convert to Islam. All these different things based off of wherever it was that they were on. Because not only would you take on the occupation and, potentially some of the perks of being under a monarch or things like that, but you would also have to convert to the religion. So, look into the Spanish Inquisition and how the Catholic Church and how Christianity was being forced on our people. Go ahead.
You want Deuteronomy?
28:36.
Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 36. The Lord shall bring thee, and thy king which thou shalt set over thee, until a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there shalt thou serve other gods, wood and stone.
So there we're going to serve other gods, wood and stone. That's not something that's new or particular to this captivity. Our people have been going into slavery, serving other gods, being forced to convert to other religions, and departing from our culture and our history. Let's take us back to the PowerPoint. See, and you can read from the third.
However, governments were always fearful the slaves might revolt, and so tried to limit access. 23rd, limit access the lives of African slaves and people of African descent in Renaissance Europe to dangerous weapons or other implements that could be used as weapons, such as long staves of knives, and to stop Africans from meeting together in large numbers.
So look at that. So there was legislation passed, right? They were second-class citizens at best. They weren't allowed to own weapons, and they tried to limit their access to anything that could be used as a weapon. So it was uncommon for them to be buying knives, staffs, anything that could potentially be used in a fight. They tried to limit our people from having those things as much as possible. And then they tried to limit social gatherings, right? Can't meet for this long. You can't have this many people. You can only meet at certain times. And oftentimes things weren't done publicly. And there was even a section that said that oftentimes our people would be given tambourines or, just loud clanky instruments so that wherever it was that they went, it's like tying a bell around a dog or a cat so you know where it's at. Our people were being given those things or even being put in chains so that they could monitor where they were going. Go ahead.
So they often passed laws forbidding slaves from carrying weapons, forbidding the congregation of more than a certain number of Africans.
Man. Go ahead.
In Lisbon, a great center for arriving slaves, there was in the 15th century a slave house, the Casa dos Escravos, which handled all the financial transactions on behalf of the crown.
Now look at that, right? So it wasn't just ball and chain slavery always in the field. These people were handling the transactions of the crown, meaning of the monarch and the royal couple essentially. So all the transactions that were being happened, they were taking care of those things, right? All that money that was being received, the king's treasury, our people were over those things. So it wasn't like we were just, just the field hands. Our people were educated, because you have to think about this, right? If a monarch imposes a 2% tax on every building in the jurisdiction, you have to be able to write each business, each jurisdiction. You're basically, what do you call that? Bookkeeping, right? Yeah. You have to be organized. You have to write the jurisdiction, the building, the address, the name, and the payment. So our people were over those things. They were, financial, they were accountants, right? Go ahead.
Slaves were valued by crown officials and price tag tied around the slave's neck.
And that's the crazy part, literally walking around like property. You got a tag on your shirt. It'd be like, oh man, your tag's showing. Our people were walking around with tags around their necks, literally showing the value of the slave. So it might be a $40 slave. They're like, okay, he probably just sweeping floors or doing other stuff. You see a slave walk through with a $1,500 on his neck, you're like, oh man, this must be somebody important. Who are you to be worth that much? But they were literally walking around with price tags. Go ahead.
Slaves could be viewed at the slave house or were sold to contractors or brokers who resold slaves at the regular slave auctions in the public square known as the Palermo Velho.
So one thing I want to say is not in Europe and especially in England and in London, it wasn't always popular to have public slave auctions, the hypocrisy of Esau, right? There's actually a slide that I put in here later on, and I don't want to spoil it too much because I want to bring that information out. But oftentimes our people weren't being sold publicly, right? Because it wasn't really like the notion of slavery wasn't widely accepted, even though there were slaves. But we'll get to that. Go ahead.
Procedures for sale differed greatly within Europe. At Valencia, at the Mantua in Italy, for example, a crucial part of a slave sale was the interview. between a slave and his potential or her potential buyer.
Look at that. Imagine that, dude.
Wow.
Imagine. That's why I said there are some really
interview.
mind-blowing parallels between now and then. So a crucial part of a slave sale was the interview. Is that not what we do today? You sit up here and look for a job. Chances are it's not going to be a super high-paying job. It's not going to be a life-changing job. But you're looking to be able to survive, right? You're just looking for food, water, shelter, clothing, which is about all these jobs are going to pay you for. Our people during this time in Europe were literally in that same position, hoping to be sold to somebody who was of value so they could have slightly nicer food, water, shelter, and clothing. But they literally had an interview process with the slaves. Come in and sit down. You literally, you had to present yourself, sell yourself. Same way that we hearing it today. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself. What are some of your hobbies? What are some of your skills? Can you read? Can you write? Do you know? Can you navigate? And that would determine where you were sold and how valuable you were. Wow. Just like we were reading in that last slide, the slaves who were working for the crown, they had to be some of the most valuable people, right? Mathematicians, recorders. They got to be highly educated, probably spoke multiple languages. They had to go through an interview process where they asked them, well, can you speak anything? Can you speak this? Can you speak that? Can you write? How neat? Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you calculate? Can you add and subtract? All those things they learned by conducting an interview with a slave to be able to see how valuable that slave was and who is going to decide to buy that slave. Because it's not between the person who actually captures the slave. It's between the slave and the person that's interested in buying. Wow. So there was literally, man, it's crazy. That's crazy. But that's nothing new. It's nothing new under the sun. Go ahead.
An occurrence that allows slaves a measure of self-presentations.
You got to sell yourself. You want to make yourself sound as good as possible. And then it'd be just like how we do with jobs. If it be one of them jobs that you wasn't all that interested in getting, you probably ain't going to do your best. And then you see a monarch walk in the room, you're like, oh, snap.
Right.
Hopefully I get bought by this one because I know it's going to come with more benefits. I know it's going to come with more perks. I know it's going to be an advantage. That's the same thing that our people back then were going through. That's the same kind of process and mindset that they were in. Go ahead.
Some slaves were very successful in refusing to be sold away.
Now look at that. Go ahead.
They feigned madness.
Look at that. So hold on. So they was acting crazy. They come into the interview process. Imagine that, right? You trying to talk to the slaveholder, telling him, look, I know how to read, write, and this, and that. Look, you got to sell me to somebody valuable. Then they like, man, look, listen, I got to sell you for whoever going to buy you. I got somebody coming in today. He's a farm owner. He's going to buy you. He's interested in you. Present yourself. So he going there and he acting crazy, talking to himself. You know what I'm saying? Like trying to act as if he has no idea what's going on so that they wouldn't be sold. Isn't that something? Go ahead.
Were thoroughly objectionable and out of control, or self-harm, as in the case of a female slave who put a sewing needle up her nose.
And the sad reality is it was driving our people to insanity and true madness, the same way this captivity is, right? Depression, anxiety, all that stuff that's running rampant through our people, gotten our people constantly trying to numb ourselves to be able to escape the reality of life. Difficult waking up knowing that somebody owns you. Difficult waking up not being truly free. Difficult waking up being subject, having no guarantee of your life. All these things that were written in the curses, all these things that have been upon our people, since we fell upon these, since the Most High put these curses upon us. So there were people who were self-harming themselves, and there was one particular case where that sister put a needle through her nose because they didn't want to be sold. Sometimes it wasn't just to get to a better slave master, so much as not wanting to be sold at all. And so this is a portrait. It's called Laura de Dianto, right? And it shows a wealthy white woman, and then she has a little black girl that she owns. So it was a example of the status of the owner determined the status of the slave. Not all slaves had nice clothes and jewelry and, were well fed. It even mentioned that there were slaves who were slaves to monarchs and kings. They had access to better education and health care. So isn't that exactly the type of struggle we go through? Like you hoping that you get some health care with your job? And that was literally what our people were doing, trying to sell themselves to hope to end up in a situation like this where they could have benefits or perks or health care in the event of injury or, whatever was going on. But look at this. Here's the hypocrisy of Esau.
Slaves in Italy were usually sold from the agents or owners' homes or premises, and only sometimes on public squares. And the same was probably true in all parts of Europe where there were not many slaves. For instance,
So real quick, it said slaves in Italy were usually sold from the agents or owners' homes or premises. So if they wanted to conduct a transaction, they wanted it to be private, right? They wanted you to come over, maybe have some dinner, maybe they drinking, then they get to talking about business, and they're selling people right out the house. The real human trafficking, right? And it says, can we start from the top?
slaves in Italy were usually sold from the agents or owners' homes or premises, and only sometimes on public squares. And the same was probably true in all parts of Europe where there were not many slaves.
That's crazy. Let's get a quick scripture, Proverbs 26 and 25. So they were usually not sold in public squares. That's why I made that point earlier when it mentioned that there were slaves being sold on public squares. That wasn't a very common practice. And that's why you can't really find, yes, you do find instances of our people being enslaved or of our people with ball and chain on and that thing. But it's not super common because slavery wasn't, even though they had slaves, they didn't accept the fact that they were slaves. They gave them enough rights or whatever to be able to justify saying, well, this isn't a slave. They have rights. They're able to leave. They go through this. They go through that. But they were very clearly slaves. 26, 25.
Proverbs chapter 26, verse 25. When he speaketh fair, believe him not. For there are 7 abominations in his heart.
Go ahead.
Whose hatred is covered by deceit. His wickedness shall be showed before the whole congregation.
So it said, man, when he speaks fair, because that's all that really was. A whole lot of terms, conditions, framing mischief by law, trying to frame things to make it seem as though what was taking place wasn't actually what was taking place. So that was the same concept that was being employed here. Even though there were very much so plenty of slaves, there were, instances of sexual abuse, amongst the women from their slave masters. The same thing that you see in our slavery here in America, maybe minus the fact that they were in ball and chain and only kept in fields and uneducated. They were educated, sure enough. Oftentimes they could get to positions of wealth if they were able to buy themselves free and released from their masters, but it was still very much so slavery. But if you try to find information about this, oftentimes they'll say that slavery did not exist. So I just found that hypocritical and ironic in the midst of all these sources and information about the slavery of our people for it to be documented that it didn't exist. Take us back to the PowerPoint. And let's read this second point.
In 1587, Hector Nunes, a forcibly converted Portuguese ex-Jew living in London.
Now look at that. A forcibly converted Portuguese ex-Jew. So who was this? Sounds like a Jake, right? He was forcibly converted. First and foremost, you don't see a whole lot of instances of Esau having to forcibly convert their own people. And you definitely don't see the same tactics that they were using on us. But mind you, they called him an ex-Jew. Forcibly converted, ex-Jew, Portuguese, right? But continue on, because look what happened.
Bought a black male slave from an English sailor for 410 pounds.
410 pounds. So he bought him for a nice little chunk of change, right? And it's crazy because based off of the way that he was described, he sounds like a brother, right? He sounds like an Israelite by blood. The thing is, so he becomes a little more successful, gets into a better financial position. He must be in order to spend 410 pounds, right? And then he gets the idea, I'm going to go buy a slave. Go ahead.
But his would-be master put it, the slave utterly refused to serve him.
So he went and bought another slave, and then the slave that he purchased was like, man, I'm not doing that. He refused to serve him, but look what he did. Look how he tried to handle it.
When Nunes went to court to try to force his slave to acquiesce.
It said he went to court. Took that Jake to court. So that's how you see our people were living really just second-class citizens. No different, really no different from how it is in America. We can take each other to court. We trying to sell ourselves to jobs, trying to sell ourselves to corporations. We hoping to get with the right master that got benefits and good pay, business perks, all those kinds of things. And then some of our people even get it in their mind that they like massa. So he go and he purchased a slave, thinking that this slave was going to work for him. And when he refused, then he tried to take him to court. Go ahead.
He found no satisfaction, instead being told that his only recourse was to apply to a debtor's court for repayment of his costs.
And then they was like, look, we can't do anything for you. Maybe if he was Esau and he was coming in with that kind of complaint, but more than likely he would have found some type of method to be able to get him to work, right? Go ahead.
In addition, as slavery was not supposed to exist, slaves could not be freed by clauses in their master's wills because the law of England did not recognize them as slaves in the first place.
Imagine that. Go over to, I believe I want Psalms 96. Let me see. Frameth mischief by law. You know that one?
No, I can find it.
94, Salakia, 94 and 20. So imagine that, right? So the perk of not actually acknowledging the fact that they were very clearly slaves, giving them just enough right and advantage to be able to say, well, you could do anything. Isn't that what we hear all the time? Mm-hmm. We very clearly go out and see jobs ain't hiring people that look like us. Not commonly. It'd be difficult. You hoping it's a Jake interviewing you so that they can have some kind of understanding and compassion. And then even then, sometimes our people be so in line with Esau, it'd be worse to get a Jake than a heathen, right? You have all these different instances and, tactics that were being used. Our people trying to survive, trying to figure out different ways to navigate. But then they would frame the mischief by law because by not saying that technically slavery existed, they technically didn't have to free slaves when their masters died, if that was in their will. So imagine that. You work for a man 20 years. He like, man, you've been so good to me, but when I die, I'm going to put it in my will to free you. Man, actually, let's read this scripture, 94 and 20.
The book of Psalms, chapter 94 and verse 20. Shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, which frameth mischief by a law?
He said, mischief by a law. Is that going to have fellowship with you? Shalom. He said, is that going to have fellowship with you? Which frames this mischief? So they're like, well, technically, slaves don't exist. So even though that brother's stuck there, he can't run away or he can be given ball and chain, right? Because they said that most of the time they only put slaves in ball and chain if they had attempted an escape, got found, and were brought back. So instead of actually acknowledging the slavery that was there, they said, well, we won't call them slaves. We won't classify them as slaves. So when a man died, imagine that. You work for this man 20 years. He like, man, you should be free. They won't do it unless it's written down. He going to put it in his will. They reading the will. You in the room. You know what I'm saying? You in the room listening to them read this will after working for 20 years. They like, free the slave. We don't have slaves. Like, man, I can't believe, man, we can only, man, in reality, that probably was so devastating. Like the nerve. Well, you're not technically a slave, so you can't technically be freed by that. Man, the hypocrisy, the wickedness, the framing the mischief by law. They didn't recognize them as slaves, but they didn't recognize them as citizens. They weren't giving them the rights and advantages as all these, the people that they were working for. They didn't give them the rights and advantages as a national, as someone who was born in that land. But they're not going to recognize you as a slave either, because then there were too many things that could potentially let you off the hook. I threw that in there because I just found that fascinating, mind-blowing, and insulting. Let's read this one from the top.
When newly enslaved African people arrived in Europe, they had to begin a difficult process of adjusting to becoming a slave. Being renamed was an especially important part of this process, as it signaled a milestone on the long journey of being forced to readjust to a life of a new social realities in a new country and to new religions.
Man, so look at that. Let's go over to Jeremiah 17 and 4. That was one of the first things they had to adjust into actually being slaves. And one of the first things was renaming them. We see all that, right? Everybody's seeing Roots, right? The episode where he said, your name is Toby. That was real. That was one of the ways. Because they like, look, the faster, that's the same thing. It's almost like a law of assimilation. I'm sure there's a name for it. It's the same thing that they do in the U.S. military, right? They remove the individualism from someone so that they only have the worker bee mindset. Cut your hair off, give you a specific uniform, and they just either give you a different name or a rank, right? Same thing that they were utilizing. They like, look, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. This is what you do. You're given a new schedule. You're given a new name. Go ahead, let's read that.
Book of Jeremiah, chapter 17 and verse 4.
Uh-huh.
And thou, even thyself, shalt discontinue from thine heritage that I gave thee. And I will cause thee to serve thine enemies in the land which thou knowest not. For ye have kindled a fire in my anger, which shall burn forever.
So, man, talk about discontinuing from our heritage. Because, you know, our names have meanings, right? It was, and that name could mean so much to the character of that person. You don't, obviously, the name doesn't define someone, but in a way, it kind of does pave a path for them to be able to pursue. You get named the strength of Israel, you got to be a strong man. You get named, you know what I'm saying? And if you get named the wise one, or, you know, the watchman, the this, the that, it's going to have to mean something, right? This and that was the same thing that when our people were being subjected to slavery, they were taking those names and giving them new ones to get them more acclimated, more quickly acclimated to being slaves. Let's continue on.
Many naming practices.
Actually, I'm sorry. And it says to a new religious alliance. So some were given Christian names, right? You're given a Christian name. You're given a Muslim name. You're given a Catholic name. Because not only is it supposed to be signifying that you're no longer born and raised Israel, you're no longer serving allegiance or praising the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now you're a Catholic. Now you're a Christian. Now you're a Muslim. Your name is going to be so-and-so Ibn Muhammad. Your name's going to be so-and-so Smith or so-and-so Swarthy. They even had what were called joke names. Like, man, he extra black. We're going to call him Swarthy. like a nickname for him. Go ahead.
Many naming practices make tracing Africans in the records complicated.
And look at that. So for so many, and this is just just off topic, but for so many of our people to be claiming specific tribes and saying they're of a particular house, bro, not only do you not, a lot of our people don't know our fathers or grandfathers, let alone trace it back through this part of history. You want to get to ancient Israel to say what tribe you was from, you got to get through this part of history. Even if you have a last name now that you could trace up until this point, which is off top extremely difficult, there were so many slaves who had their names changed. So they arrived one name, they were given another name when they became slaves. And then if they were sold, say if you were sold from a Catholic to a Christian, you might be renamed again from a Catholic name to a Christian name. Say your slave master didn't want to call you Ibn Muhammad. He wasn't a Muslim, he was a Christian. Now it's going from Muslim to Christian. So it's so many different names that our people were given. You really just see the effect and the, how deep it goes of how much we were destroyed. Go ahead.
It is difficult to know from 15th and 16th century documentary sources who was an African, unless their place of origin or skin color is spelled out. Uh-huh. When Africans were enslaved and taken to Europe, they were given European Christian names and were forced to drop their own names. A few North African Muslims held on to their own names. So, for example, there was a North African slave named Barak in a Genoese document from 1432. But sub-Saharan Africans mainly did not. Uh-huh. Another identifying feature of slaves was that they could be branded. Man. Slaves belonging to the Portuguese crown were branded on the arm. All slaves taken to Sao Tome from Benin or elsewhere after 1519 were branded with the cross on their upper right arm. Later changed to a G, the Marca de Juin in Spain, slaves were branded with an S on one cheek and an I signifying clavo, a nail on the other, so that the whole read esclavo, the word for slave.
So look at that. Our people were being branded off the boat. It said, what did it say? It said they either got a cross on their upper right arm, and it's crazy because don't our people get that tattooed now? Our people be like, man, really nothing new under the sun. So many of our people, and it's not a shot, obviously we've done things in ignorance, but it's like, man, look at the practices that we so commonly adopt as common practice or as what, is just what to be done or cool or whatever, fashionable. And that was a mark of a slave, to be branded on that arm so that they could know, okay, well, this slave comes from a Christian household. This slave has a Christian master. Wow. They were branded, it said on the cheek. Imagine that. That had to have hurt. A S and an I signifying a clavo, a nail. Then on the other, so that it read esclavo, the word for slaves. Like, you could see it on their face. Oh, that's a slave right there. He's been branded. That's a slave, been branded. It said, in Italy and elsewhere, slaves are branded only if they ran away, not as a primary means of identification. So sometimes, not every single slave had the S or the I. They didn't all have the cross. Some places they were only branding slaves once they had attempted escape to be able to mark the ones that were specifically, troublemakers, so to speak. And then in other places, all of them were branded. So we talked about some of the slavery. There was also some rulership during that time, right? One in particular, King James. There's been quite a bit of information put out on King James. I believe we have a authenticity of the Bible lesson, but I still wanted to talk about King James because it's notable. Go ahead.
James I, born June 19th, 1566, Edinburgh Castle, Edinburgh, Scotland, died March 27th, 1625. Theobald, Hertfordshire, England, King of Scotland, as James the Sixth, from 1567 to 1625, and the first Stuart King of England from 1603 to 1625, who styled himself King of Great Britain. King James did not write the King James Bible, also called the King James Version or the Authorized Version. He did commission it, however. James made the project his own after Puritans attending the 1604 Hampton Court Conference requested that a new translation of the Bible be made. 47 scholars were enlisted to help, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Richard Bancroft, at their helm. The first edition was published in 1611. The King James Version turned out to be resounding success, highly regarded for its unprecedented scholarliness and its literary beauty. It was adopted by numerous denominations and remains the translation of choice for some congregations today.
So this is a notable figure that you have during that time, right? So first and foremost, a lot of our people were enslaved, right? You had a lot of slavery that was going on in Europe, across various different countries with various different practices. So there are people who were political figures who had, vast wealth, big estates, those kinds of things, but they weren't monarchs. They could have been nobles to a monarch. They could have been, a slave to a monarch, still having that pull and that reputation, that status, but not necessarily being named in the history books because they weren't the top guy. People just look for the face when you're talking about rulership all the time, right? They want to know who was the top. But a lot of our people were in those positions, just not noted. And so King James, being one of the rulers of that time over Scotland, right? Scottish, like one of the most, you talk about Scotland today, first thing that's going to pop in my head is going to be Edomites. But this was the Jake, right? Ruling over Scotland during this time period and using his authority to have commissioned a transliteration of the scriptures at that time, known as the King James Bible. And those are some of the images of King James. All right. And then another notable people of rulership that you had during that time, especially in Spain, were known as the Moors. Go ahead.
The Moor, who ruled Spain for 700 years, introduced new scientific techniques to Europe, such as an astrolabe, a device for measuring the position of the stars and planets. Scientific progress in astronomy, chemistry, physics, mathematics, geography, and philosophy flourished in Moorish Spain. It was due to Moorish education that enabled the renaissance of the scientific revolution.
So that's what we read earlier. Jacob is the former of all things, right? It was because of a lot of the things that our people were doing that the Renaissance even cracked the way that it did. And a lot of the information that's been brought out that's still relied on, or those scientific advancements that are still being practiced in medicine, those objects of theology that are still being studied, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, all those things. There were a lot of breakthroughs, right? Because the Renaissance was known as the rebirth. A lot of those things came from our people's inventions, our people's innovations, our people's contributions into Spaniard or European society. A lot of those things. Go ahead.
Many of the Moors remained in Spain. Those who remained faithful to Islam were called, what is that? Murahades. While those who accepted Christianity were called Muhares. While those who accepted Christianity were called
Moriscos. That was a typo.
Moriscos.
My bad. I didn't mean to cut you off, but that was a typo.
Yeah,
It should have said those who remained faithful to Islam were called Murihades. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce that. And then cut off. And then while those who accepted Christianity were called Moriscos. So there was a different marking for each one that accepted based on what you accepted. Go ahead.
The reins of their Moors' horses were as fire, their faces black as pitch, that they're shone like burning candles. Their horses were swift as leopards, and the riders fiercer than a wolf in a sheepfold at night. The noble Goths, the German rulers of Spain, to whom Roderick belonged, were broken in an hour, quicker than a tongue can tell. O luckless Spain.
So that was a reference of, it's right below, quoted in Edward Scobie, The Moors in Portugal, Global Expansion, in Golden Age of the Moor, Ed Ivan van, well, you guys see it if you want that. And I just want to pull up this quick little excerpt right here. All right, specifically talking about some of the exhibitions and contributions that our people made. Let me get the aux. I meet the aux line. Is this it? Nope. Is the aux unmuted?
You said what?
Is the aux unmuted?
No, it's not on mute.
Orchards. Paper, a material still unknown in the rest of Europe, was everywhere. One of the most notable achievements of the Moors was the learning they brought to Spain that would eventually influence Europe, which was then in the Dark and early Middle Ages, into the very well-known Renaissance period. In the 10th and 11th centuries, public libraries in Europe were non-existent, while Moorish Spain had over 70.
So that's two things, right? He said that our people had influenced a lot of what caused the boom that was known as the Renaissance, right? All the advancements, all the studies that our people were doing which pretty much allowed those advancements to snowball into the Renaissance. And it said that there were no public European libraries, but Spain had over 70. Look at that.
The Moors also founded 17 new universities, and historians speculate that it even sparked the formation of Oxford University. In 1105, when Christians arrived in Toledo, Spain, they were greeted with these universities and libraries filled with manuscripts of Greek and Roman knowledge lost to the Europeans, along with Arab mathematical and philosophical texts. The Europeans were dazzled by what they found and soon began flocking like moths to a light bulb, and they immediately set up a translating program in Toledo to translate the works into Latin. Other notable achievements made by the Moors include the trend of changing clothes according to the weather and season, and wearing different clothes in mornings, afternoons, and evenings. A scientist and poet named Ziryab also invented a type of deodorant to get rid of bad odors and promoted morning and evening baths, all of which were unheard of concepts in the rest of Europe.
Gross. So while our people already had the custom, instead of changing between night and day, wearing different clothes based on the season, and there was a brother that even invented a type of deodorant, and he and it's crazy how he had to promote before it to be accepted, bathing in the morning and in the evening. It said a concept that was unheard of in the rest of Europe. So the rest of Europe was funky. They wasn't really doing bathhouses. They weren't really bathing themselves. That wasn't common practice. Whereas our people had to bring those things to Europeans so that they knew to bathe themselves and how often to bathe themselves. You know, there are historical references that talk about Europeans that would bathe once a week, once a month, annually. So these things, bathing daily, was a mystery and unheard of to Esau in most of Europe.
The Moors also made considerable contributions to architecture. The best surviving examples are La Mezquita in Cordoba and the Alhambra Palace in Granada, as well as the Giralda in Seville. This highly sophisticated society lived with incredible tolerance of other faiths. Thousands of Jews and Christians lived peacefully under the Muslim rule, and this socio-economic prosperity was unparalleled for centuries. The Berber people are still around today, living in the arid lands of northern Africa as they have for thousands of years, perhaps unaware of the great advancements that people have brought to the world. If you like these kind of videos,
Highly doubt they're unaware. All right. So some of those advancements, some of those things, and these were some of the depictions of the Moor. I remember there was mention of this. Whoops. There was mention of this crest, right? It pretty much signified rulership and something else. I didn't include it in here, but it was something interesting that I found talking about the Moorish crest. But here's the thing, right? And it's kind of irksome because oftentimes when you see the Moors get described or be spoken of, or even it's more specifically depicted, they're oftentimes Arab looking. Even in that video, they kind of went back and forth between dark-skinned looking Arabs to what may more than likely have been Israelites. But the Moors, they seem to have been Israelites, right? They were in positions of rulership, very clean, very innovative. You know, they were doing big things. They were applying scriptural principles. They seem to have been Israelites. But, of course, you know, our history and things have been so destroyed and so lost. A lot of times you see this as being credited to the so-called Arab man when that doesn't seem to be the case. It says, and look at this, right? Moor comes from the Greek word moros, plural mari, meaning black or very dark. So it's like, man, who else was that talking about? Not to say there were no other melanated people, but they were very clearly a black people, right? And then you so commonly seen like these fair-skinned, really closer to white kind of Arabs being depicted when that was not the case.
The Latin word for black was not maro, but niger, or fusco for very dark. In some but certain, not all cases, Moors were described as fuscas.
And I realized I just put that excerpt in there twice. We're going to have to read that again.
Moor comes from the until the Reconquista conquered the Umayyads and the Moors. Moorish scholars were making many scientific discoveries. Moors had many libraries and universities before the rest of Europe.
So look at that. So our people had libraries and universities before the rest of Europe, a lot of which were actually destroyed. And that was that's a good factoid to actually go look and research, because I think it was from another clip, but it might have been from a source that I didn't put in here. Our people, while we were making all these advancements, right, which literally sparked the Renaissance, sparked that rebirth, our people, like it was mentioned in that video, there were already 70 public libraries in Spain under Moorish rule, while the rest of Europe didn't have any. They formulated and founded 17 universities and potentially Oxford or Cambridge? I think he said Oxford. That's one of the most renowned, highly educated. Like if you're a scholar, a history buff, you really want to get some information. People think about Oxford. Cambridge, I think, is still publishing a lot of Bibles and Apocryphas. So you're talking about really, real fascinating, rich, and old history. All of those things, but they were potentially, well, they say potentially with Oxford, but a lot of those things were coming from our people. The innovations our people were making, the lead way that our people, the past that we were defining in these advancements, all these things. That was all, in all praise to the Most High, that was coming from our people, right? All those things are coming from our people. Now, a lot of the Moorish libraries ended up being destroyed, a lot of the records lost. Especially as the people were conquered. I wish I would have put that in there because now that's why you see so much kind of a mix. Not to say that there were no Arab Moors, but that wasn't the common narrative, not that I've ever seen. And just knowing that every time that our people had made those advancements, every time our people had, those innovations, they always got destroyed. The library in Alexandria, the Moorish libraries, they talking about they had over 70. So you can imagine how much information that there was between all of those libraries, how many books, how much stuff has been lost because it was destroyed and likely captured sitting in some museum somewhere. But they just like, look, we won't put this on display, but y'all can't have it. It said, so they had universities and libraries before the rest of Europe.
As Spain and Portugal conquered Iberia, this new scholarship culturally diffused into Europe, sparking the Renaissance.
So look at that. So as they were conquered and as they were taken, into captivity, as those libraries were being burned, destroyed, and taken, captured, then all of that information that was well known to the Moors, that was being researched, studied, and advanced upon by the Moors, all of that information diffused into Europe, and that's what sparked the Renaissance. Talk about the former of all things. Our people truly are a former of all things, the salt of the earth, right? Go ahead.
Saint Isidore of Seville, who was born in 560 CE and died in April 636 CE, wrote that Moros means black in Greek. In the late 1400s, the Italian Roberto da San Severino in his writings clearly distinguishes between Moors and Arabs. Spanish usage came to have an even broader usage to mean Muslim in general, just as Rumi from the Eastern Roman Empire came to mean Christian in many Arabic dialects. Thus, the Moors of Mindanao and the Spanish-speaking Philippines and the Moriscos of Granada.
Kyle, I'm glad I got you reading these. I'm glad I got you reading these. I'm like, man,
Work with me,
I can't help you with that one. I'm just trying to sound these out myself. God. But man, so you just see, man, it's, like I said, so much of the Renaissance, so much of what was happening, all the information, even to this day, right? A lot of the things that were happening during that time, the torture, the experimentation, they really paved the way for modern medicine, learning the anatomy of the body, everything, this is here, this is there, this is how this works, this is what this organ does. A lot of those advancements came from the Renaissance and came from our people in particular. So many of the, like inventions like the astrolabe, right? Let me see, let me go back up real quick. I forgot exactly what it did. I know it had to do with astrology. But just so many of the things that were commonly used, so many of the things that were introduced into European culture and society were actually our people inventing these things and innovating these things. And then Europe or Edomites getting the tail end of it, and that was still enough to cause a boom. So I believe that's going to be the conclusion tonight. Again, we always encourage that you go and do your own research and investigate these things further. Please continue to tune in with us throughout these lessons. There's a lot of different topics. Obviously, this one was world history according to the Bible, looking into these different time periods, looking into, the lives and influence that our people have had throughout the course of history. Because so often it's just starts at slavery, and not even just any old slavery, because there was a lot of slavery in here, but it starts particularly with American slavery. And it's mind-blowing going back to look at these things and researching and gathering this kind of information, because it's like, man, out of all the Black History Months that we had growing up, out of all the assignments we got in school, all the months that we was taught about, you know, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and, you know, these, you know, Malcolm X and these certain influential figures, you'll never hear really about the Moors unless it's from our people. You'll never hear about Spanish society. You'll never hear about slave auctions and private meetings. You'll never hear about all these things. And you definitely won't hear that Jakes get credit for the Renaissance. So it's like, man, just all this time that we spend here in this country and in this land, being told that our, you know, this is what our history is, and the whole time it goes back so much further and it's so much richer. So I hope this was edifying, Israel. Again, please continue to tune in with us and continue to watch and support these classes. Please continue, you know, like and share these videos so that they can spread out. More of our people can be educated and awoken to the truth. All praises to the Most High. We're going to sign out for the night, and with that, we say shalom.